The next entry mode we're going to have a look at in this video is franchising. And this is in effect actually a specialized form of licensing. It's usually a little bit longer term and it is generally used by service firms, whereas licensing tends to be much more common amongst manufacturing firms. So there are a couple of key differences there. So in addition to selling the intangible property, like trademarks, to the franchisee, so that aspect is shared with licensing. The franchisor here also tends to insist on the franchisee agreeing to very strict rules as to how that business in the foreign country is actually run. So you probably get slightly higher degree of control in franchising relative to licensing. So as with licensing, you do have the franchisor who usually receives a royalty payment, which is generally a percentage of the franchisee's revenue. So however much they make, a certain portion of that is returned to the franchisor. So again, you have this situation where somebody is running the business effectively on your behalf, using your technology and your trademarks and intangible property to conduct business in that foreign country. A good example here, and as I say, given that service firms are most prominent within franchising, a lot of fast food chains like McDonald's, as you can see on the screen here, do utilize franchising when they expand overseas. And you can see a few different options as to how they are slightly different, the different Happy Meal options and meal options across the globe. My personal favourite though has to be our friends at McDonald's in Germany, where as part of your Happy Meal you get not only a little adorable toy but a cup of beer. Why not? That's what we want for our children. Magnificent. Another good example of franchising, a common example of franchising, is hotel chains. So the Hiltons, not those Hiltons, we're talking about the actual hotel chains, although they are, of course, that is part of why they are famous and so very rich, because their family owns the Hiltons, with the hotels named after them. And that there is the hotel, the Hilton in Honolulu in Hawaii. I've personally stayed there. I've seen those fireworks. It is just as spectacular, if not more so, in person. So if you haven't been there, do it. You won't regret it. So it's fantastic. But a lot of hotel chains are franchised businesses, and that when they do expand around the world, that's how they use, or that's the entry mode that they employ. There are some advantages here for franchising. Certainly, like licensing, it means that you can avoid many of the costs and risks associated with opening up some form of operations in a foreign market. Again, you've got somebody else doing that hard work for you and running the business on your behalf. Firms can also very quickly build a global presence. So if speed is a priority when you're looking to expand overseas, franchising is a fairly good option here, because often you have people who have that existing local knowledge, the franchisees, who can set up quicker than probably you could if you were looking to expand overseas yourself and build that presence on your own. On the downside though, it does inhibit the firm's ability to take profits out from one country to support competitive attacks in another. That is, to shift your profits from one part of your global network to another. And the reason for this is because usually, as I said, and as we illustrated with the McDonald's example, franchisees, while yes they do have to abide by a strict set of laws and policies, there is usually some wiggle room for them to be able to run their business with some degree of autonomy. That is, to do things slightly differently. And of course, the franchisees, they're not in it to make money for you. They are running that business to make money for themselves. So your ability as a franchisor to coordinate your global operations becomes much more constrained than in some of the other entry modes. There's also the issue of the geographic distance of the firm from the franchisees, which can make it difficult to detect poor quality. So this in turn leads to real issues with quality control, especially when there are a large number of franchisees. If you only have to worry about a small number, it's probably easier to keep tabs on exactly how they're running that business. But if you're a company like McDonald's and you've got probably thousands, tens of thousands potentially, of franchisees across the globe, it becomes difficult to pick up issues like this. A couple of years ago, McDonald's had a highly publicised concern around the quality of some of their food outlets around the world, including in the UK, which is obviously a very highly developed country. So there is that issue, that overriding issue relating to quality control that becomes difficult to manage when you have so many different franchisees spread all across across the world so far away from the home market. The next entry mode we're going to look at here is joint ventures, and this involves establishing a firm that is jointly owned, hence the name, by two or more otherwise independent firms. Now, most commonly, joint ventures do tend to be roughly 50-50 split, so you end up in a situation where two different companies own exactly half of this newly created joint venture. But there are some examples where firms do seek a joint venture with a majority share, obviously greater than 50%, so they own more than their other partner in that joint venture. The key takeaway here, though, is to understand that you do have two separate firms coming together and creating a third independent separate firm that is owned and controlled by those two original separate parties. So think of it this way: if you've got company A here, look, isn't she lovely, company B, very handsome, coming together to create an adorable company C, look, it's remarkably similar looking to a junior Andy there. That is what a joint venture is all about. It's not a merger, it's not an acquisition, they are separate things, and we'll talk about that soon. So that's where you have two companies forming to become one. And that's, as I say, quite different to a joint venture where you have two separate companies who create effectively a third adorable little baby company. So some prominent examples here: the phone and telecommunications company Sony Ericsson was created, not surprisingly, by Sony and Ericsson. Fuji Xerox is the coming together of Fuji and Xerox to create this new company. So that's the key point to understand here with joint ventures. And yes, in case you're wondering, they are photos of Andy's parents in the 80s. Oh, that was not a good time for hairstyles, was it? There are a number of advantages with joint ventures. So it does allow you to benefit from a local partner's knowledge of the local conditions, the culture, language, political systems, and even business systems, the infrastructure and the institutions that make up the key parts of that local business environment. You get a real advantage if you are expanding through joint ventures. You can choose a local partner who should have knowledge of all these different conditions and environments. There's also the advantage that the costs and risks of opening that an operation in that foreign market are then shared with your partner, obviously whether it's 50-50 or some other percentage, but you're not having to go it alone from a financial perspective and a risk minimization perspective. You do get to spread that across another partner as well, so it's less risky and less costly from that perspective. And it also means that you can usually, not always, but usually satisfy many of the political considerations for market entry. So a lot of the time, governments, as we've discussed in previous weeks, will impose legislation that effectively says something like every firm within this industry must be at least 50% owned by a local firm. And that will, of course, prohibit foreign firms from entering that market on their own and establishing their own wholly owned operations. So to sort of bypass that, to get around that, joint ventures are a great method because it means that you can still expand into that market, but also satisfy the criteria of that legislation imposed by the local government. There are some disadvantages that it's important to be cognizant of here as well, though. There are risks giving control of your technology to a partner firm. It's probably, in some respects, actually more dangerous than with something like franchising or licensing, because here you're creating a whole new thing that somebody else has actually at least part ownership in. And so they have probably even more rights to that ownership of the technology that you're giving access to for your new partner here. There's also the issue that it may not have the tight control necessary to realize experience curve or location economies, and we've talked about the benefits of those in the previous slides. And shared ownership can also lead to conflicts and battle for control of this newly created joint venture if the goals, objectives and outcomes actually end up differing potentially from the outset, or especially if they do change over time. And a prominent example here is depicted in the top of your screens here. Now, this particular joint venture was going to be, or at least proposed joint venture, was going to be between Tiffany & Co., the famous jeweler, and Swatch, the famous watch manufacturer, and they proposed a new company called Tiffany & Co. Watches, not surprisingly, very original, and it seemed like a match made in heaven. Tiffany wanted to expand into the luxury watch area. Swatch were happy to contribute to that as well and expand somewhat and have that link towards an upmarket brand. So they both put in a lot of resources and effort into establishing this new company. And then things started going south, and it got to the point where basically Swatch started saying, well, you're not really trying here to Tiffany, and there were accusations back and forth, and it ended up in court. And it went from a very happy romance to that romance being smashed into a million little shards there, as you can see. And when it did get to the court, the finding was that Tiffany actually owed Swatch the minor sum of $450 million US, and that was representative of the amount of investment that Swatch had contributed to this failed joint venture. And it was largely, as I say, based on the issues surrounding the goals and how much time and effort was being put into the creation and sustained success or pursuit of that success of this particular joint venture. And I think we actually have some footage here of the executives at Tiffany when the ruling was announced, I think. Yeah, and that's about how it went down, I think. So that is joint ventures. We've got a couple more entry modes to go that will continue on in our next video.